We are recording. Okay, so this is Rob Myers. Rob
Hello.
has, I can't believe it, 30 years of experience. I did not think you were that old.
Thank you,
And
Jean.
Rob is, he is an instructor at Agile for All. And I don't remember when I met Rob, it was several years ago. I was struck by how joyful and delightful he is, and how good he is at unclenching me when I get clenched, and that can be a job once I get clenched. He's going to talk to us about TDD and BDD, and we reached out to him specifically because if you follow him on Twitter, he is a huge advocate for TDD. Even when the guy who is the father of TDD walked away from it, he said, "Hey, Kent, why?" So we reached out to talk to him tonight. And tonight we are recording everything for replay. Please wait for the mic to come to you before you ask questions, or we will need to repeat your question in order to get it recorded. Thank you, Rob.
Thank you. And hi, Jean. It's been a while since I've seen you. So I don't know what you're seeing on your screen right now. Hopefully you're seeing me. I did just want to start by, I can see you, you can see me, and eventually I'm going to have to switch over to, yes, I'm going to say it, prepare yourself, PowerPoint. There's a couple of different technical issues that I had with, I was actually originally going to sort of stand up here and do some hand waving and that sort of thing, and puppet shows and things. But the lighting's not very good in here, and there were a couple of other things. For example, I don't have any puppets. So we're running into some technical difficulties, so we're going to use PowerPoint, and hopefully that won't cause more technical difficulties. But before I start that, I'd like to just kind of get a hand raise sort of thing from the people that I can see, and we'll use that as a very rough sort of estimate. How many of you are currently actively doing test-driven development on your team? Yes. Testify. Okay. How many of you are doing behavior-driven development on your team? Yes. The same person raised his hand both times. I'm so excited. Okay. So how many of you are in management? Okay, good, good. And how many of you are testers? And how many of you are developers? Actually, wait a minute. How many of you are developers? Let's do that first. Okay, now I'll go back to the trick question. How many of you are testers? And everybody should raise their hand. There we go. Okay. All right. Now I'm going to say a little bit more about myself, information that's related to what we're talking about today. But first of all, for the sake of recent neuroscientific studies that tell me that I need to give you something to chew on while I do that, I'm going to go ahead and start with a little visual demo of test-driven development. Now I'm going to assume, how many of you just, you don't even know how to spell it? Anybody? Anybody want to admit to that? Okay, so you probably have some familiarity with test-driven development. But what I've noticed over the years of talking to people about it is that they sometimes have fairly interesting misconceptions about what it is. So I do want to sort of introduce the topic. And this introduction also applies to behavior-driven development. So it's kind of an introduction to both of those practices. And then we'll sort of split them apart and talk about what the differences are. Okay, so here we go, PowerPoint on a Mac. Let's hope the whole thing doesn't burn up. Oh, yeah, that's not quite right. Yeah, I knew something was going to happen, but I know how to fix that one. We just had it working a minute ago, and then I had to go and play with it. Okay, there we go. Now I can't see anybody anymore, so I'm just talking to a screen, and I can see what you can see. But hopefully you can see what I can. You can see me still, right? Okay, so.
Rob, we cannot see the PowerPoint.
You cannot see the PowerPoint, you see me. Oh, I know why.
Unless you're an animated PowerPoint, which would be fantastic.
Yes, I found, okay, now here's the problem. I didn't press the magic button.
Can you share the screen?
Yeah, we were doing that earlier and then I forgot. Okay, now you're seeing my desktop, which is perfect.
Yes, I see the hut.
Okay, thank you for telling me. I could have gotten all the way through it and never would have known. One more try. Here we go. Okay, that's weird that that's over there.
Very awesome. I think we see it.
Great, and I want to pin. Let's see. Okay, no, there's no pin. All right. So what you're seeing right now is two people who are using the latest neural implants to do pair programming in the cloud. And please note that they are smiling. They are happy to be doing this. And the cloud is pretty much tabula rasa. It's empty. Okay? So what do? They write a test. And it goes bonk. Wait a minute. Why does it go bonk? There it goes. More technical issues with PowerPoint. So they write a test, and the test fails. Why does the test fail? Because there's no code, right? And notice that they're still smiling. Okay? They write a little bit of code. They run the test again, and now it passes. They do it again. They write another test. It fails. They write a little bit of code, run it, run both tests, and they pass. And here's one of the important things that people often miss. The next step is to refactor. Even though they've only got two tests and maybe 2 lines of code or 2 little things, they still take just a second to look over the code and say, have we introduced any sort of duplication? Have we introduced any sort of what they call code smells? And the reason why we're talking about this now is because we have to remember to do it every single time we do this. So then they just proceed forward, writing another test. Oh, that's the rule of refactoring. Okay, so they just did a little refactoring. See, they started with that. They said, okay, we'll delegate. Then they continue to write a test, make it fail, write a little code, watch it pass. And what they're doing is they're sort of circumscribing the behaviors of the system in tests. They're creating an executable specification. In the case of test-driven development, it's an engineering specification. And in the case of behavior-driven development, it's actually a product specification. But it's they're also, each one of those is an investment in that particular behavior. So that will be a fixed sort of a fixed line in the sand, so to speak, about that particular behavior, allowing the team to change the design of the blue stuff. The blue stuff is fluid, and the green stuff is the hard outer candy coating. Okay? And notice that they never stop smiling. They're happy. They're done with their task, whether that's a 5-minute task or a 4-hour task. They're done with their task. They're ready to commit, push to master, let it build, however far it goes. They're done. Okay? If at some point they decide that they need to add new behaviors, they just pick a spot, crack open the hard outer candy shell, start adding new tests, and create more software. And that's how this embryonic software becomes an entire system. Over time, very small steps, very quickly. Okay, that's pretty much the introduction for you into test-driven development and behavior-driven development. Now, a little bit more about myself very quickly. I, as Gene pointed out, am far older than the hills. So in 1986, I was on my first internship, starting a nice, lucrative professional career as a software developer. And I would say from about 1986 to about 1998, I gradually started to really hate it. And the reason why was because there wasn't any sort of Agile or anything like that. But what we would do is we would design the software and be very careful about how we were designing the software. And then we'd be very careful about how we built the software. And then when we were done, we would deliver it to the customer. And the customer would say, that's nice. How about if we add a new feature? Or that's nice, but you just got this one thing wrong. And it would sort of negate the entire software design. We would go in and we would sort of build something on top of the side of it, like a big wart on the side of the software. Invariably, we broke something, right? No matter how careful we were, we broke something. So I was getting rather frustrated and was thinking about a nice career in real estate when all of a sudden in 1998, I came upon my first extreme programming coach. And this really opened my eyes and made software development make sense. It seemed like a sane approach to software development. At the time, it was called extreme programming. The word Agile wasn't being thrown around at that time, and neither was test-driven development. In fact, that practice was known as test first at the time. Just a little bit more about me. In 2002, I decided to take the show on the road and delivered my first test-driven development course. And the course that I deliver today is, it's different. It's a lot better than it was at that point, but it sort of has roots in that particular course. And the last but not least, hopefully sometime this year, I'll finally finish the book. And I'll just introduce you to the book. That's the book, okay. So hopefully you'll see that come up in maybe December 31st of 2008, just in time not for Christmas. But here's the thing. So I've got about 75,000 words written so far, including code, a lot of code, all to describe just one. Oh, I'm skipping over that. Never mind. That was supposed to get deleted. All to describe this. 3 simple words. Make it fail, make it pass, make it clean. Okay, it's a really simple process. And at the same time, I feel like I'm still learning things about this particular activity after all those years. So there's a lot of subtlety to this. It's not as straightforward as it seems. Okay, now I would say that this study that was specifically around test-driven development, and it also applies to behavior-driven development in a very special way. And this is pointing out what I call level 1 benefits of these practices. Does that mean somebody joined us? I heard a bell. Okay, I'll pretend it means somebody joined us. Welcome.
It does. Yeah.
Yeah. And thank you for not braving the snow and ice. Okay, so and you may all be familiar with this. This particular study was done in 2008, so it's been around for a while, 10 years. It doesn't mean that it's not true. It just means that it's old. And a couple things to point out here. You do have a cost to these practices. You're writing a bit more stuff. And but I do like to point out that it's an initial development time hit that I feel goes away after about a month at the most. Notice I said a month at the most. Okay. When I've worked with teams within about a week or two, they start to see the benefits of doing test-driven development very quickly, or behavior-driven development very quickly. I don't know, it's not typing speed that's slowing you down. Now, for that pay down, you're getting 40 to 90% decrease in defect density. So that's the initial, that's level 1, okay? And I do want to talk a little bit about level 2 and level 3. If you're looking for any more recent information than that, I do have something from one of my clients. The one thing I do like to point out about this is not only did they manage to reduce the number of defects in their system by doing test-driven development, but they, you'll notice before the TDD training, how it's going up and going down. And what they were doing was they would have what they called bug fixing parties, which is like a GI party in that you don't want an invitation, right? You don't want to be there. And what they saw is that they would fix the bugs, then they would release the code back to their clients, who in this case were fairly particular lawyers. All of them were lawyers. And so they did not like bugs. And then they would find more bugs than they fixed. But this is an oscillating graph here. And teams are not systems that can handle oscillation. They like steady state situations. So this is the kind of thing that was tearing the team apart. That's one of the other things that this helps with. By having a more stable level of defects, you don't have this horrible cycle that's going to just, ruin you and keep you up at night, okay? Some of you may recognize this. It's the important Japanese rock garden. Now, I want to tell a little story to get us to level 2 and level 3 benefits from these practices. So we just set the Wayback Machine to 2001, and I'm in Portland, Oregon. In fact, a little side note, this is not my first AgilePDX meeting. We used to be called PDXP, right? I think there's a connection there between the two groups. So I visited PDXP quite a few times in that year. And I was working with a guy that some of you may know, Jim Shore, and he and I were working on a project that was essentially a web application suite, and one of the applications they had was a survey builder. I think that was the name of it, was Survey Builder. And Survey Builder was a lot like SurveyMonkey. You could create questions and you could create multiple choice answers. And when I joined, they were already in operation for about a year or so. Some of the best code I'd ever seen. They were doing all of the practices. They were doing test-driven development. And something happened. A little bit of background, the Survey Builder, they said, didn't have to be internationalized except for North America. Because of the structure of the organization, I believe, they had said, well, we're just going to take care of North America, which was pretty much, Spanish, English, and French for the most part. That was the majority of the languages they needed to support. And this was an application in Java, which meant that in order to internationalize the application, we had to do absolutely nothing, because Java basically handles the Latin American character set by default, no problems whatsoever. And we had been pretty much reassured that that would be enough. One day, the product owner or extreme programming customer comes into the planning meeting, which actually was in a different state. It was in Utah. We would go back there once every 2 weeks. And so we're back in Utah, and the product owner, XP customer comes in and says, hey, remember when I said that we would never have to internationalize the application suite? Well, let me just ask you a question. We have Japanese clients now, and they'd like to be able to write their surveys in Japanese. Strange request, right? So basically, we needed to be able to handle them typing their character sets, their own native character sets, into their browser, which the browsers could handle at that time. Then the information has to get to our servers, has to get into the database, and then when it's time to give the survey, has to come out of the database, go through the servers, back to somebody's browser, and show up in the right character set. The browsers are beyond our control, and they were not the problem. I remember thinking, I was there for maybe 3 months at the time, and when she said this, I remember thinking, oh my gosh, major architectural change. This is just going to blow the team to bits, right? Jim, if you know him, you know that he's a very steady kind of guy. He just calmly said, well, let's take 10 minutes, look at the code, and we'll give you an estimate, okay? And they were doing, at the time, I think we were doing ideal days. If you don't know what those are, just think gummy bears, okay? It's essentially the same thing. So, so we were gonna come up with an estimate in ideal days. And so he looks at the code, and if you've ever worked with Jim, if you've ever paired programming with him, you know that it's impossible to keep up. So he was flying through the code, looking at things going, oh, that's interesting, and then flying to some other class and some other method. Oh, that's interesting. And I'm like, what's going on here? And then he stops and he says, hey, I think we can actually have this done in 3 days. And I'm thinking to myself, what did I get myself into? We're going to just completely revamp the entire architecture of this and internationalize an entire web suite in 3 days? I don't think so. So, and I like to say, that's when Jim turned to me and said, don't worry, Rob, it's just an estimate. So we did it in 3 days. We got the whole thing accomplished in 3 days. And in fact, we spent the first 2.5 days researching. We spent the first 2.5 days finding out whether it was even possible. And once we knew it was possible, we found I don't know whether it was called Babelfish or Alta Vista at the time. It was essentially Google Translate at the time. And it did this. You type in your character set, and we could actually switch our browser so that we could type in kanji characters, and it would go, you know, kanji characters in, kanji characters back out. If you didn't have the server configured correctly, you'd get kanji characters in, and you'd get boxes out, you know, these little box. So hello, box. Thanks for registering with Microsoft.com was one of the examples we used to find out that nobody knew how to do this. But we knew it was possible. The next thing we needed to figure out is whether it was possible in Java. And so we went on the, whatever they were at the time, Experts Exchange or whatever, and found out that absolutely nobody in the entire world knew how to do it in Java. So we were on our own. We looked at the Java docs and we figured it out. And the last half a day of our 3 days we spent building it. And I would say that over 3 days we wrote essentially 10 lines of production code. So we were very, very productive. It's about 3 lines of code per day. We also had about 50 unit tests, and we delivered it. We needed to shut down the database and a few other details, but not really relevant. We did it in basically 3 days, and afterwards we said, well, you know, usually at retrospectives we talk about what things we need to repair. In this case, we decided to look at what went right. Why were we able to do this? And here's where it really gets interesting. We said, okay, so what was going on there? And what we found was that inadvertently, we had managed to sort of, not inadvertently, but through diligent refactoring, but not specifically with any goal in mind, we had taken all of the user input and output code and reduced it down into these 2 methods in one class. So these 2 methods were handling either all input, user input, all dynamic user output, going through 2 methods. And we were like, well, why did we do this? Just basically because it was the right thing to do with refactoring. So you never really know which refactoring is going to pay off, but this one really did. Whatever it was that led to this state, that did it. So we identified refactoring. And of course, you can't do diligent refactoring. You can't do fearless refactoring without test. So TDD comes into play there. TDD or BDD. Oh, that was weird. Thanks, remind me later. Okay, sorry about that, folks. Yeah, I'm surprised my system isn't deciding to update or something like that. It's not like I'm busy doing anything right now. Okay, so test-driven development, behavior-driven development, same effect. We did have a couple of other things we identified. And I do have, my point, and I do have one, is coming up. Continuous integration, the process by which we take whatever we just built and we get it integrated as close to master as possible, which for us was master. So, you know, push to master and build on master. And effectively, that was one of the other practices we identified as really helping us out. And the reason why that helps out in refactoring is because if you try to refactor on a branch, guess what? Somebody else is doing a completely different refactoring on a completely different branch, and you're going to have a massive crap to deal with afterwards. Okay, so continuous integration. And then lastly, pair programming, by which we're refactoring with another person to tap us on the shoulder and go, oh, no, right? That's awful. Don't do it that way, right? And I've found repeatedly over the past 30 years of programming, more than that actually, but professionally, 30 years of programming, that if I'm programming alone, I write stuff that nobody else can understand. Okay, sorry, I tapped the microphone there. I write stuff that nobody else can understand, but if I have one other person working with me, it's understandable by a group now. Okay, so that's what I wanted to point out about all these practices. All these practices have one thing in common. They are all communication mechanisms within the team. We're communicating with test-driven development, we're communicating with intent. With refactoring, we're communicating the how, right? How do we actually get the system to do these things? With continuous integration, we're communicating what refactorings went on and what code we wrote so that other parts of the team, other pairs can use it. And with pairing, obviously, that's a communication mechanism. So this establishes multiple communication mechanisms amongst the team. And of course, like I say, you can substitute BDD for TDD right there, and you have effectively the same little pyramid here. Okay, so let's look a little bit at what the differences are between test-driven development, behavior-driven development. So on this team, we're coming back to the present now. On this team, you're basically having developers build their own safety net. It's the engineering specification. It's of, by, and for developers, okay? That was the original intent of test-driven development. And we very quickly, even in 2001, started trying to use the unit testing framework to express customer tests, acceptance tests, if you will. We call them acceptance tests. And very quickly, there became an approach called acceptance test-driven development, which is somewhat similar to behavior-driven development, but not quite, okay? And so we saw a need for a different set of and executable specifications, if you will, surrounding the product and be more customer-facing. So now what you're seeing inside of that big green circle of honeycombs there is the whole team. You've got the product owner, you've got the Scrum Master or the XP coach or whomever, you have your business analysts, you have your testers, you have your documentation people. And then outside of that, you have customers and other stakeholders. And they are customer-facing tests. So the engineering specification tells the developers the why we did things this way, and the product specification says what it is that we've invested in, basically. So that's, you know, I kind of actually, before I move on, I sort of want to stop and see if there are any questions. Do we want to, am I clear?
We see no hands. Okay. Everyone's still with us? Okay, we're ready to move on, apparently.
Okay, good. So this is getting to the heart of the matter here too, because this is what you came to see, right? You know, when do we use one, when do we use the other? I do want to go a little bit over some of the scenarios, just a little sample scenario to talk a little bit about behavior-driven development if you're not familiar with this. The advantage of behavior-driven, that's hard to say, especially when you're hungry. The advantages of behavior-driven development over test-driven development are mostly about the audience, okay? So the unit tests are, like I said, the audience is other developers, or myself 6 months from now when I'm trying to figure out what the heck I was thinking. The behavior-driven scenarios are more about what everybody can read, right? So the audience is the entire team, including potentially stakeholders. Now, you're not going to like use it as a user documentation or anything like that, but it's basically a product specification. So, and they look like something like this. I'm going to use a silly little example of Lisa Simpson. And Lisa is using something similar to Amazon.com or some kind of online bookstore, but this particular bookstore has a feature, or we're building a feature, one might say, to offer book clubs. Now, for those of you who may not remember or may not have been around then, book clubs and record clubs, they used to do this thing where they would send you a little notice once a month, and here's the offering that we're giving you. And if you didn't actually fill in the little form, you'd get those books or records. And then you also got an invoice for the books or records. So basically, if you did nothing, you bought 2 books per month. And you only needed to buy like 4 books per year. So if you weren't careful, you'd end up with 24 books that you didn't really want. Now, the other thing you could do besides just sending it back and saying, no, I don't want those books, is you could send back alternatives. Like, I don't want those books, but these other books look pretty good. I'll take some of those, and that counts towards my 4 books. So that was called an alternative. So if you read this, the stuff in blue that you're seeing there is pretty much all that Cucumber offers you. They just give you basic keywords. They do a lot of stuff behind the scenes, but the Gherkin language is basically given when then, right? With some others, there's an and, there's a but, and there's an asterisk, and there's some other things that you can do. But this is the basic form. And it sort of models after, if you've ever done use cases, you have preconditions, that's given. You have actions, that's the when, and then you have post conditions, that's then. So looking over this, Lisa's wish list contains the book, and that book is a book club alternative. When Lisa views her book club options, a star of some sort, and we're not really giving a whole lot of detail. We're just saying we're going to put a star by that book name. And notice that there's no talk about web applications or JavaScript or Windows or, there's no technology in here whatsoever. She's not saying click on this or type this in, none of that. It's just very much around the business logic, the business rule that we're trying to test. A friend of mine, Dale Emery, liked to say, imagine that you had the best interface, that it was like, telepathy. You could just think something and it would just happen in the system. That's the way you want to write these. So I want to compare this with one other, also from Lisa's book club, and that's the bell jar here. Now, what I've done is I've changed some of the words that were in the previous one to blue. And what I mean by that is, if we went from the first one to the second one, these would already be built out, okay? So is a book club alternative now actually has what we call glue code, which is glue, right? It's gluing the test scenarios to the system under test in some way, shape, or form. And the developers can sort of work on, decide, or the team works on and decides how do we want to do that. We can use Selenium to talk to the web browser, or we can just go in proc and actually call the objects under test. And anything in between there. There's all sorts of different layers that we can get to. We could strip off the UI, go straight to a web service. We could go past the web service and just talk to in Java, it would be the jar files or the DLLs in .NET, right? You just talk to them directly. Whatever is the most optimal and really what's fastest for testing this particular, there's nothing in here that says anything about a web page, okay? There could be, we could be testing web pages, we could be testing navigation, but that would be a separate scenario. Okay, that's very important. One scenario isn't going to stand alone, right? You're not going to ship a product with one or two scenarios. You're going to ship a product that has all sorts of orthogonal scenarios hitting at it in every different direction. So the only thing that the software developers would have to build out, besides the actual behaviors, the system behaviors, but to build out to get this test to run and actually fail correctly, has already purchased the second line. That's the only thing that wasn't in the previous scenario. Okay, and then of course a stop sign instead of a star. Now it's kind of hard because I'd have to, let me give you a little bit of a moment to just look back at this previous one, okay? So if she has a book club alternative that is also on her wish list, she gets a star. In other words, hey, Lisa, look at this. And the second one is if she's already purchased the book that's on the selections, she gets a stop sign like, hey, Lisa, don't buy this book again, right? Why waste your money? Now, this brings up questions, and it should. Could there be a stop sign and a star, right? Or is there, is it one or the other? Does one override the other? Which one? So there's a third scenario that comes up because we've written these two scenarios. And that's how these practices work. And that's one of the powers of these practices. And this happens in test-driven development all the time. You write one or two tests and you're like, oh, what about that scenario? Okay. So behavior-driven development, in a nutshell, it's the same cycle as test-driven development. You're just writing the scenarios, they go red, then you build the code and they go green. The nice thing about this is when it goes green, you could also do, it's ready to do exploratory testing. And there's no way that we're ever going to not be doing exploratory testing. This is human testing. It can't be automated. It requires a human mind until we have artificial intelligence, which, don't worry. You can see how many bugs are in our software these days. I'm not too worried about artificial intelligence at this point. And so it's available to you. And here's the thing. Sometimes you find the need to still bounce into the test-driven development cycle. And I'm going to talk about the times that I found that that's still appropriate. So it's possible on a fairly simple application that behavior-driven development, or either or one of these, not both, would be sufficient. But there's a lot of cases I found where I'm watching a team, they're doing behavior-driven development, and they're like, hey, you know, this is just going to be too weird to do this in Cucumber. What do we do? And it's like, well, just drop into the TDD cycle until the test passes, right? So let's look at some of the reasons why we want to do that. Combinatorials. What I mean by this is, imagine, for example, that you have a whole bunch of feature switches, let's say, right? You have a dozen, just say a dozen feature switches. Well, so there's a dozen different features that we could activate or deactivate. Imagine the combinatorials that go into making sure that, you know, feature A works with feature 12, sorry, right? That just blows up. Now, you could do that with test-driven development, or you could do that with behavior-driven development. One of the things you're doing when you add it to your specifications, though, is you're sort of cluttering the specifications. The more that these tests look an awful lot alike, the more noise there is. There are more stuff people have to read in order to understand what the differences are and why. So you get some cognitive overload with too many scenarios. So that's the kind of thing that TDD might take care of. The other thing that happens, and this is one of those things that only TDD can really do. Well, I'll say, yeah, I would say that it's essentially a power of test-driven development, is that if you're using test doubles, you can break up the combinatorials. So you can say this feature switch, let's say it's talking to another feature somehow, and you need to test that it's doing the right thing when that feature says, I'm down, I'm not available, or something like that, right? You can actually use test doubles to unit test all of that stuff. And that actually breaks the combinatorial. It's not a combinatorial problem anymore. You'd effectively have, if you have 12 feature switches, you might have 24 tests, right? Which is not anything next to the combination of all the tests that would be possible. So TDD is able to, you know, you're isolating an object, you're isolating its behavior. On the one hand, on the one side, you have the tests, then you have the object under test, and then over here, you have the state of the object in that test scenario, which is a test double, or it's, you know, some set state. So the test has complete control over the state of that object, and is able to just unit test it. And that's what we really mean by unit testing. We're testing a unit of behavior in that particular object or that particular function.
Rob, could I pop
yes.
in with a question here?
Absolutely.
Am I understanding correctly that test-driven development is about code quality and making sure there aren't bugs in the code, where behavior-driven development is making sure that the code is meeting the requirements? So it's really more requirements-oriented.
Yeah. In a nutshell, that's one of the things that's been said, is that test-driven development is about building the thing right, and behavior-driven development is about building the right thing. And I think it's an important thing to notice, but both of these practices have so much more value than that specific statement. And for example, we've talked about how test-driven development, I've had a lot of experiences where that you know, you're building the thing right. In other words, you don't have any bugs. That's that level one. Level two, which I don't really think I talked too much about, but I'll cover back if you think back to what the story I told. Level two is really the ability to complete a story within its, I'll say, its natural cycle time. In other words, if I have a 3-day story, that's 3 days because I just started on a project and the project is greenfield. Is that still going to be a 3-day story 3 years from now? And if the answer is no, then I haven't really allowed for the cycle time of that story to stay stable. One of the powers of test-driven development, if you do it well, if you cover everything and try not to think too hard about whether I should test this or not, you've got this safety net that allows you to build that story in any order at any time, and it will take as long as it takes, right? So that's the second level power of these practices. And then the third level power, which I sort of introduced, and I'm glad you asked this question because I kind of maybe forgot to tie that in, but it's kind of nice that it comes from a question. The third level is when your customer or your product owner comes up with a story. Now, they know a lot, it takes a lot of context, okay? They know the team, they trust the team, they've had a lot of you know, a lot of sprints with valuable stuff coming back to them. They know what the product does right now. They know what the product can't do. And they wake up one morning with an idea, or they get a request from a customer, like our request, you know, can we please crack open the Japanese market? And oh, by the way, we might even be cracking open the Chinese market, which is even bigger, right? I don't think they did that, but that we could just use that as an example. They did actually just make a lot of Japanese clients very happy, which was a big deal. I mean, it was the top of our backlog, right? So it's these amazing ideas that your product people will get where they go, oh, if only we had this one thing. And you have to ask yourself, you know, I mean, a lot of you think about this. Have you ever seen a story where you were like, wow, that would be really cool, but we can't possibly do that? Or that would be really cool, but it would take us 6 months of work?
Rob would like to just jump in. We're having a hard time being sufficiently impolite, so we have a question online.
Yeah,
Okay.
so you were just talking about the powers that you have from TDD and BDD. How do you use this, or how do you convince, you have a manager, an engineering manager who's a little scared or adverse to TDD or BDD? How do you convince them?
Really good question, and not an easy question to answer. I would say they want to know the cost and they want to know the benefits, right? And the costs they tend to be over exaggerated. You know, people are like twice as much code. Well, it's really 3 times as much code, but it's a different kind of code. It's a very simple, you know, writing tests is actually, when you get used to it, it's extremely simple because it doesn't have any if statements. It doesn't have any for loops or anything like that. It's just a script, right? So you can produce a lot of those very quickly. And if that's your thought process, it doesn't really add a whole lot of overhead. So you could pretty much argue that test-driven development is cost-free. However, you actually have to be doing it well. So you probably need, you know, read a book, or, you know, read my book, get some coaching or whatever to make sure that you're jumping over those hurdles that are getting in your way. And it's usually up here, right? This is the thing that stops us from doing it well, is that we start to second guess ourselves. So
We have another question in the room.
Oh, have I finished answering that question? No.
Oh, okay. I don't know. It's a question answered.
I think the other thing that you can do is, well, you could give them this video. Hopefully the video will turn out well, because the interesting thing about that, and I'll finish answering both questions together. How's that sound? So the interesting thing about that story that, you know, internationalized the thing for the Japanese was that it was unplanned. It was unplannable. We couldn't have possibly known that it was going to come up. It was obviously very valuable, and it was very disruptive. And I call them, you know, based on the Talos stuff, I call them sort of black swan stories, right? They're very rare, they're very disruptive, but they're very valuable. And when I finished with that project, I even said to myself, you know, that was really cool. We were able to get that thing done, but that's never going to happen in my career again. That was 2001. And then in 2002, I had it happen 2 or 3 times in the span of 1 year. And in 2003, it happened 2 times again. And I was like, this is happening on average about once every 6 months, just to me, right? So the interesting thing is that black swan stories, just like black swan events, they can't be predicted, but they're going to happen. You know, they're bound to happen. You just can't possibly know when or what they're going to look like. So in order to provide for these awesome stories, for these innovative stories, you've got to be doing this. There's no downside because the upside is so much greater than the downside. So the potential benefits so outweigh the costs, perceived or real, that it becomes like a non-argument. It's like, you got to be doing it, right? There is one other practice that helps people get past that hurdle, which is that, oh, well, we've already got 3,000 lines. I remember this one. I used to teach test-driven development at Microsoft. And it used to be a 2-day course, and it became a 3-day course because of this. I had one or two people come up afterwards, and they said, that was great. I really hope to be using that at my next job because I have, and I think the quote was, 400,000 lines of legacy untested .NET code. And it was like, sorry, it was like, a knife in my heart, because if you think about it, test-driven development predates .NET by quite a few years. So there's really no reason that anyone should have to deal with 400,000 lines of legacy .NET code, especially at Microsoft. And
we do have one more question in the room if you're ready for it.
Okay, so I'll just,
okay.
The technique is called characterization testing. So it didn't show up on that screen as one of the three because I usually wrap characterization testing in with test-driven development. So there's test-driven development and or characterization testing. There's BDD and or characterization testing with Cucumber, which you can do. And then there's exploratory testing. Okay, yes, I'm ready for my next question.
Excellent. Here you go.
Hey, Rob. My name is Atul Khanapure. Thank you for your time today.
Thank you.
So my question is, what advice do you have for teams who are supporting or maintaining an existing system that's older and now you want to all of a sudden start using test-driven development? What advice do you have for those teams?
Oh, great question. See, now I wish I had gone ahead and taken your question before I mentioned that, because like I say, the practice that I found was the gap that keeps people from actually doing test-driven development is that they have untested code that needs to be tested with characterization testing. And so the practice that I recommend in that case is, okay, so I got this blob of untested code, horrible blob of untested. I've got to change this if statement to an if else. I've got to change the conditions of this if statement to have an and. Whatever it is, whatever tiny thing that it has. And I ask myself two questions. What exactly do I want to do? And then do I have tests around the old behaviors? And if the answer is no, I don't have tests around the old behaviors, I put my characterization hat on and I go add characterization tests. And the difference between characterization tests and test-driven development is that I'm writing tests to try to cover as much of that existing behavior. The tests pass when the existing behavior is untouched, even if it's buggy. I'll build tests that make sure the bug stays there. I can't fix it because I might break something else, right? So I've got all of the behaviors of that module tested out, right? And then I can do test-driven development on the new behaviors. Okay, I write the test that says it does this new thing, it fails, and then I go make the change that I already knew I wanted to make. And so it can be very frustrating at first because you're writing characterization tests around a module or a method, and then you're writing your tests, and then you're actually getting to do the code, which you know you could have done anyway, but it just prevents so many defects that you're going to recoup that time, that disciplined time that you're spending on these practices, you're going to recoup that by not spending time in a debugger anymore. 2002, we had about 20,000 tests, all of which ran within 10 minutes. And so if that's a little bit of a shock, I'll repeat that. 20,000, they now have 30,000 tests. They're still running after whatever that is, 16 years. They have about 30,000 tests. They all run within 15 minutes. And we used the debugger twice in a year. The whole team used the debugger twice in a year. Compare that to how much time you spend in the debugger, right? Searching for bugs. We didn't search for bugs, you know? We usually had a test that would fail or no bugs. So this is the kind of thing that's when it really starts to, you start to realize, oh, this is really paying off because I don't have to spend time in the debugger. The other way that you recoup your time, by the way, is I had a talk with the guy I worked with in 2002, another name dropping another famous author and friend of mine, Richard Sheridan. The project that we worked on in 2002, he says is still going. And he says that the last time that any software developer had to work an evening or a weekend to repair a severe bug was in 2004, 2 years after I left. So that's 16 years something like that. 14 years without a bug. 14 years without a severe bug.
Wow.
It's possible, and that's the thing. You have to embrace characterization testing, which is probably the most painful of the practices, but at the same time, it can be fun. It can be interesting.
Can we interrupt you for a second to ask one quick question?
Uh-huh.
What's your difference between a characterization test and a test-driven development test? You've kind of laid out that there's a difference between them, but you didn't highlight what that difference is and how it makes it better to do just characterization tests versus a test-driven development test.
Sure, and better's not the right word, but absolutely. So characterization test is a test that was written after the code. So now that might end up being a pretty detailed unit test or a series of unit tests if your code is well written so that it's testable. But most cases that I see, your characterization test tends to be this really big, ugly blob. And in fact, what you're trying to do, it sort of mirrors the code. If the code is a big, ugly blob, your characterization test tends to have to be a big, ugly blob. So characterization tests, the forcing factor with the characterization test is effectively this. I want to spend the least amount of the team's time getting the most amount of behavioral coverage in the code. Okay, we don't set aside 6 months and do this. We still look at, okay, I'm building this story. I need to make this change. I need to, I find this bit of code that doesn't have tests, and I build tests to cover the behaviors in the code. And we're looking for things like behavioral boundaries. Like if there's an if statement, there are 2 tests that need to be written. And the reason why the tests are so painful and egregious is because usually it's like coupled to 8 different things, and so I have to mock out 8 different things. And then we can do testing. Oh, I'm getting a lot of feedback. So
and we've got 2 more questions.
Okay.
We've got 2 more questions to let us know.
Yeah, I do want to say that they're not at odds with each other. You don't do either or. You put on your characterization hat, you do some characterization testing, you take it off, you put on your test-driven hat, and then you do the test-driven stuff. Okay, so the key why I'm doing this, actually physically doing this, is because we have to be conscious that we're not going to do both at the same time. When you write characterization tests, you don't want to see them fail and then pass because you're writing new code. You want to see them fail and then pass because the tests are wrong until they're right. Okay, so they feel very similar, but they have very different intents. Another way of looking at it is if you look at the whole suite of tests as your safety net, your test-driven development tests are very fine-grained and very pinpoint accuracy. And then what you do is you find those areas that don't have tests, and it's like sewing a big patch onto your safety net, okay? It's gonna get covered. You're gonna cover the things you need to. It's not gonna be pretty, okay? Yeah, okay.
Hi there.
Hello.
I'm a UX designer, and exploring the overlap in between UX design and Agile. And I'm curious about behavior-driven development because it sounds like there is a lot of overlap there. Can you speak to that?
Yeah, a couple things. I would say behavior-driven development is going to be very script-oriented. So, and I don't know a whole lot about UX design, but I know that there's a lot of it's a lot more than just UI, right? It's how we interact with the system. So there's some overlap there, and I often suggest that UX be seen as sort of it's like a business analyst product. It's a product side sort of focus that you know, as best as possible, could be embedded in the team. But this is an activity that's very important to do at the same time as behavior-driven development effectively. You know, for a story, the impact of the user experience needs to be addressed at the same time that the software is being built. The other thing I want to say about that is if you want a place to look, take a look at what Menlo Innovations is doing out in Ann Arbor. They have what they call software anthropology, which is effectively agile UX, right? So that's a good place to point you towards.
We've got 2 more questions lined up for you.
Okay.
Do you want to take questions? Okay. Okay. So do you want us to put questions for you in the meetup to respond to later and get through your slides, or
no, what
would you like to do?
Okay, either way. I don't want you guys to stay and freeze or anything like that. So this is, you can see the slides later. So if you want to ask questions, I'm fine with that. But if somebody really wants to see the other couple of bullets, how TDD and BDD fit together, you can ask that question. How's that sound? So yeah, let's go.
Okay.
Let's go with questions.
Okay. Let's take a couple of questions here. There you go.
Yep. Hey, sorry, I'm going to throw out some terms that you might then have to explain to everyone. How do you view, so kind of recently I've been digging into this idea of spec by example, and I was curious for your thoughts on at least the core idea there and its application to behavior-driven development. Do you see those as tightly tied together or as different things?
Yes, I see them. Yes, both. Let me go back to this. Yeah, I didn't mention specification by example because I sort of see it subsumed or included in behavior-driven development. And specification by example is effectively, as far as I know, you're not trying to cover all the different details at the behavior-driven development level. With Cucumber, you're trying to cover enough. You're trying to give examples, targets, essentially, and you're allowing for a responsible team to build out the rest of the tests in test-driven development. In fact, that's one of the things that TDD can be used for. It's like, oh, wait, well, we didn't really cover that in behavior-driven development. We don't necessarily want to, so we'll do it with TDD. But specification by example effectively is the writing of those scenarios. Now, the thing that, so one of the things, a little history here, there was that state in the evolution of Agile where we had something called acceptance test-driven development, where we'd essentially build the scenarios and the testers would build those and the developers would be building the code to meet those tests, but they were sort of happening in parallel, and they would communicate when it was necessary. But this is actually far more immediate than that. This is, so if you look at those 2 characters at the top, you can presume that one of them is a developer and one of them is a tester or a BA. And so those 2 people are pairing together to actually get the specification not only written, but to pass, okay? Now, if the developer says, well, this is going to take me a while and you might not want to see, how the sausage is made, why don't you go work with Joe on one of the other scenarios, and me and Mary will get together, and that's over at the right side, and we will work on doing test-driven development to get it to pass. So behavior-driven development can be very immediate. You work on one scenario at a time, you get that scenario to pass before you write the other scenario. So it follows the test-driven development pattern a little more closely than specification by example. That's my understanding, and I've been wrong before. I thought acceptance test-driven development and behavior-driven development were essentially the same thing for many years, and until I ran into Richard Lawrence and he straightened me out on that. So. Can I get out of PowerPoint? It feels so uncomfortable and itchy. And then I can bring you guys back on the screen here somehow. Yeah. Now you see me and I see you, right? Okay. But I don't hear anything.
Would you like another question?
Sure.
Here we go.
Okay, I was trying to follow you on how you would do a characterization test. And so you write this patch test that's a big blob and you're about to go into a development mode with TDD to fix something, but you have this as your safety net. So all of a sudden, so you do the development, it passes it first, and then you start doing TDD and you get to where you point, and then it won't pass. You fix your test?
Well, yeah, no, not quite. So yeah, I sort of may have misspoke. So your characterization test, when it becomes part of the patch, the assumption is that that is going to continue to pass. It depends on what you're actually going to do next. If you've just covered a bit of behavior that you think is a bug and you're going to fix the bug, then yes, that test is going to fail. Normally what we're doing is we're just, and in fact, this is the step that I missed. Once you've gotten that safety net around that code, let's say that code is a big blob, like, it's a full screen method. It's just huge and it's ugly and it covers, and it's talking to 3 different subsystems. And you say, okay, now that I've got a test for all of that, or maybe probably 3 or 4 tests for all that, now I can refactor it some. So I'm not even going to go into test-driven, I'm not going to write a test yet, but that is part of test-driven development, right? At any time, if all the tests are passing, you can refactor. So you're going to refactor that down to the point where, okay, this is the area that I need to change right now. I've got this, extract method, boom, okay? So I had this. I pick this piece, I move it over here, and I go, okay, now I've got that in isolation. The characterization tests are all still testing this, and they're not unit tests because they're twice removed or once removed from the thing that I'm testing. But now it's over here, and it's tested. Now I can write a new test, a new unit test on that method that says, okay, now I need the new behavior, and that test should pass when I change the behavior, but the other test should continue to pass. If there's a conflict there, then you've got something else going on, okay? And it is possible that it might break if you change something, if you change some significant behavior, but for the most part, it's really supposed to be continuing to pass. It's still part of the safety net. Now, here's a caveat to that, though. If you're going to fix a bug, or you find a bug, let's say that you're doing characterization tests and you find a bug. This often happens when I'm coaching teams. After the test-driven development course, I've talked to them about legacy characterization testing. Lo and behold, when we sit down the next day, usually for coaching, usually the thing that we're doing is characterization testing. It's unfortunate, but it's true. And in the process of characterization testing, I would have to say about 75% of the time, we find a defect that they didn't know about. Yeah. And so what do? Well, I say, write the characterization test that makes sure that the defect remains. Okay, this is really frustrating because it's like, we found a defect, we need to fix it. And I'm like, okay, let me tell you the true story about a one-off error, right? where it was a one-off error in a library. And so the workaround for all the consumers of the library was to do what? Add one, right? You go fix the bug, what happens? You just break all of your client software because now they have another one-off error. So you can't just go in and fix the bug. You have to kind of talk to the team and go, where is this bug prioritized in the rest of the backlog? And when are we going to fix it? And when we fix it, we've got a test, a characterization test that we can name it after the bug number. If you've got a bug tracking system, change the name of the test so that it has, oh, and this is bug 38924. So when bug 38924 or story 38924 shows up in your backlog, you go, oh, I've got a test for that. All I have to do is change the conditions of the test so that it works right. Because right now I've got a test that says it works wrong, and it passes when it still works wrong, okay? You're actually preserving the bug in amber, so to speak, right? And then in order to remove the bug, make the test fail, and boom, okay? Then you're doing test-driven development with the characterization test. Does that make any more sense? And
she's nodding her head.
By the way, I can always come back and do another one of these just specifically on characterization testing, and I'll actually throw some code at you.
Which might be necessary as it is time to wrap up, and there are still questions in the room. This last questioner has a list. So how can we pass additional questions to you, and would you be willing to share your slides?
Oh, I am definitely willing to share the slides, and I am also willing to answer email. One of the slides actually has a whole bunch of contact information. I can either put that up now or I can
peachy.
Give that.
And we can also put it in the Meetup so that people can see it that way.
Right.
And that way it'll get out to people who didn't come tonight, and you will be deluged with questions. Thank you so much for providing so much information this evening and inspiring some really good questions. Listening to a technical practices coach talk about what they do sure makes Agile look different to those of us who aren't coders. They live in a different world. There's some contact information there, and we want to thank everyone for coming, and we will try to get the recording published in the next month or two. I know, we're new at this, kids.
Oh, by the way, that's
Thanks
about
for
how long
coming.
it'll take me to answer your questions too by email. Sometimes it takes about a month. Gene can attest to that.
Yeah. Actually, if you get him in Twitter, he's responsive. Okay, thanks, Rob, and thanks everyone for coming.
Bye all. Safe travels home. Thank you.